In our humanities unit, we've been studying wars and peace, which is a fundamental component of Montessori education. As Maria Montessori was, she lived through 2 world wars and was sort of heavily influenced by this and wrote an entire book and collection of speeches called Education and Peace. So one of the things that makes Montessori education special is this emphasis on peace. In order to study peace, what did we do? We learned about 20th and 21st century wars. We learned a little bit about the Civil War, and we read a couple of seminars, articles related to peace. But most importantly, we went on this trip together in our, I guess, extended neighborhood, I should say, because it's a COVID year. We decided to stay a little closer to home, and we ended up traveling to Antietam, Gettysburg, Harper's Ferry, and Washington, D.C., each location having something to do with war and peace in some capacity. And while we were on our trip, our online students created their own itinerary for their trip that also focused on elements of war and peace that they could see and participate in from home. And one of the things that they told me at the beginning of the year when I asked them, what do you want to study this year in humanities, is they said, we don't know anything about more recent wars. They're like, Revolutionary War, been there, done that. Civil War, done that, right? War of 1812, we've learned about all of these. We want to learn about more recent wars. So I said, okay, we're going to do 20th and 21st century wars. And the students got to choose which war it is that they wanted to study in particular. And I asked them to create a short documentary about the war, fusing voiceovers and pictures, as well as develop a mini lesson to teach the rest of the class about their war. And we did all of this prior to going on our trip. So I wanted to share some of these documentaries with you because I think they did a really fantastic job with them.
From July 28th, 1914 to November 11th, 1918, country borders were changed, warfare grew more violent and destructive, and more than 16 million people lost their lives. How did this happen? Who sparked the events known as World War I, the Great War, and the war to end all wars? In the years prior to World War I, tensions were high, and many kept their armies at standby. Alliances were made in an attempt to retain peace.
In the end, there were the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, against the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, who would join later in the war. It was assumed by many that the war would be over by Christmas, unaware of the 4-year-long inferno that was just beginning.
In the First Battle of the Marne, French and British armies successfully defended and counterattacked the German army, halting their plan in defeating France quickly. The Western Front soon became a battle of the trenches, where the enemy wasn't the only thing that soldiers feared. Disease and rodents were common in the damp and muddy trenches, gas from the enemy, as well as orders to charge over the top into no man's land, had soldiers frightened. In the east, Russia had started attacking German-occupied regions, though were halted by the German army. Many things developed in World War I, such as planes that dropped bombs and shot other planes out of the sky. Cannons and artillery were made bigger and more deadly. In the ocean was a new, lethal, frightening weapon called the German U-boat. The U-boat was capable of submerging under the water for periods of time, able to sink ships while almost being undetectable. Later that year, the British developed a new weapon, the tank, named from its cover, being a water tank for troops. However, the very first tank was ineffective, so it was another year before it was used in September 1916 at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, part of the Battle of the Somme. It was made to ride over trenches. However, the Mark I tank that was used broke down many times and was slow compared to today's tanks. On November 11th, 1918, with the countries that formed the Central Powers falling apart, armistice was reached. The conflict that was World War I had ended. 4 years of intense warfare were over. Many soldiers had injuries, both physical and psychological, that would be permanent. Landscape and buildings were also damaged. Countries changed, governments and borders. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Germany was forced into signing the Treaty of Versailles. This was cruel to Germany as it tore apart the economy and limited Germany's military. The Treaty of Versailles helped spark another war years later, an even bloodier war, one built on hate, led by a man with a mustache.
Germany sent Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled to Switzerland, back to Russia in hopes he would create an internal conflict, and that he did. He overthrew the government, exited World War I, made a country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, bankrupted the country, caused a famine, and then he died in 1924. The two superpowers and opposing sides during the Cold War were the U.S., who had a capitalist economy, which is an economic/political system where industries are controlled by private owners for profit, and the USSR. The Cold War was a conflict of ideas between communism and democracy. Although the two superpowers came very close, they never actually engaged in direct conflict. However, they did engage in the arms race, which was to see who could have the biggest nuclear arsenal, the space race, who could reach space first, and proxy wars, which are wars instigated by a country, but they don't participate.
The Iraq War, or the Second Persian Gulf War, started on March 20th, 2003, when President Bush announced that troops had been deployed to destroy Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and to end the dictatorship that Saddam Hussein held. While the main goal of the Iraq War was to capture dictator Saddam Hussein, that was accomplished on December 14th, 2003, after getting tips from his family and bodyguard. The end of the war was many years later because of the Iraq militants and Al-Qaeda. On June 8th, 2006, Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda, was killed in a U.S.-led airstrike, making people in Washington hopeful that the war would end soon.
The Iraq War was fought like most modern wars. U.S. troops scouting certain territories, small skirmishes, and tactical assaults. The United States utilized airstrikes a lot in this war, which were effective but problematic. The only problem with this was the amount of civilian lives that were actually taken. Many people actually protested the Iraq War, as Saddam was captured so early into the war, yet the U.S. kept fighting. Most of the skirmishes were fought against small militant groups, mainly ISIS, people supporting Saddam, and Al-Qaeda, which led many suicide bombings around the country. But the reason people protested this war is because it was just unnecessary violence, like stated earlier, of all the civilian lives taken in Iraq and all the American troops being killed, as well as the Iraqi troops. The United States deployed 1.9 million U.S. troops in Iraq, and there are still 2,500 in the Iraq and the Middle Eastern area. Although the war is over, there are still 2,500 American soldiers fighting in the Middle East, specifically Iraq and Afghanistan. The remaining soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan are to be removed from these countries by September 11th, 2021 by order of President Joe Biden.
The War on Terror is a military campaign launched by President George W. Bush combating Al-Qaeda. Former President Bush announced the war less than 24 hours after the 9/11 attacks led by Al-Qaeda, an international terrorist organization founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden. Although the war was primarily focused on Al-Qaeda, former President Bush states that it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
The leading cause of the War on Terror were the 9/11 attacks in New York and D.C., said to be triggered by the U.S. support for Israel and the Persian War, and for the U.S. supporting Russian atrocities toward Muslims. Al-Qaeda's roots can be traced back to the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. 9 years prior to its founding, Osama bin Laden visited Afghanistan and assisted in the organization of the Arabic people to battle the Soviets. Bin Laden became more militant under the direction of Ayman al-Zawahiri.
On September 11, 2001, 19 men, all affiliated with the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda,
began the 9/11 attack by hijacking 4 airplanes across the United States. 2 of the airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center buildings, 1 crashed into the Pentagon, and 1 crash landed in a field in Pennsylvania after the passengers of the plane fought back. Over 3,000 people died that day, and thus began the War on Terror. Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia in 1957. He is most famous for founding Al-Qaeda along with other extremists and his influence in the 9/11 attacks. Saudi Arabia was in extreme poverty and in war with multiple other countries during his childhood and adulthood living there. Bin Laden was one of over 50 children of Mohammed bin Laden, a self-made billionaire who moved to Saudi Arabia from Yemen. Bin Laden went to university in King Abdulaziz University. It is said this played a major role in bin Laden's future as Al-Qaeda's leader, as not only did the university bias his extreme beliefs, it gave him the skill required to market Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was killed in 2011 during a raid of his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, led and ordered by Barack Obama.
Currently, Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are fighting with the U.S. The only country that lost the war was Iraq, and now more countries are fighting the U.S. because they are allied with Iraq. In 2014, former President Barack Obama officially ended the war in Afghanistan. Obama states that military success in the battlefields have enabled this end. However, over 10,000 troops remain in Afghanistan.
The War on Terror is currently going on and it has caused much chaos outside the Middle Eastern countries and America. One of the main consequences of this war was the advancements and growth of terrorist group ISIS. ISIS has been the inspiration for over 140 terrorist attacks from 2014 to 2018. ISIS was founded in 1999 by Zarqawi, the devoted devotion to Al-Qaeda, who formed almost 11 years prior. After 9/11 and the beginning of the War on Terror, ISIS wasn't the only repercussion. Multiple countries' airports and public transportation services increased in security, causing much fear in the people around the globe. Shortly after 9/11 and former President Bush's announcement of the War on Terror, multiple protests and strikes occurred throughout the United States. On October 7, 2001, around 10,000 to 12,000 people gathered and protested against the War on Terror, saying things such as, "Don't turn tragedy into war," and "Our cries aren't for war." The group marched from Union Square to Times Square. These protests did not only happen in America. In Germany, after announcing allyship with America in the war, around 30,000 protesters took the streets across the country, shouting, "No war, stand for peace."
The Vietnam War was a long and costly war for both Vietnam and the United States. This war was a battle between North Vietnam, or Communist Vietnam, and South Vietnam, which was allied with the U.S. To have context on this topic, we must date back to centuries ago. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century. During World War II, Japanese forces invaded Vietnam. To fight off both the French and the Japanese, Vietnam's leader at the time, Ho Chi Minh, formed the Minh Viet, also known as the League of Independence of Vietnam. After Japan's defeat in World War II, they withdrew from Vietnam, which left a French-educated emperor, Bao Dai, in control of the newly Japan-free country. Minh Viet forces saw the opportunity to seize power and took control of Hanoi, a northern Vietnamese city. Hanoi became the capital of the newly created Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh as president. Attempting to regain control of his country, Emperor Bao created the State of Vietnam in July 1949, with the southeastern city of Saigon as its capital. Both sides wanted a unified Vietnam, but Ho Chi Minh modeled his nation after communist countries, while Emperor Bao was a monarch. In July of 1959, the first American troops of the war were killed by a guerrilla attack through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In September of 1960, Ho Chi Minh was replaced by Le Duan due to health problems. In May 1961, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, sent 400 helicopters to southern Vietnam for military support. To combat the Ho Chi Minh Trails and other guerrilla attacks, Operation Ranch Hand was put in place, which is where herbicides were sprayed on the forests of where the guerrilla troops stayed. This would kill the plants, depriving the guerrilla troops of camouflage and food. There were many civil problems within the two territories, especially the South. Ngo Dinh Diem's strong liking to Christians caused many issues with Buddhists, to the extent that Diem's palace was bombed in 1962 by non-Christians in southern Vietnam. In May of 1963, the major incident of the Buddhist crisis took place. Ngo Dinh Diem opened fire on Buddhists in Hue, a city in central Vietnam, and 8 were killed, including children. In November of 1963, after many Buddhist protests against Diem, the United States assisted in killing Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother.
In 2014, after the Ukrainian Revolution, pro-Russian separatists began protesting and eventually rioting in a region of Ukraine called Donbass, a collection of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. The separatists wanted to remerge Ukraine into Russia, effectively robbing them of their independence they gained from the Soviet Union in 1991. Eventually, these riots turned into a full-blown armed conflict with the Donbass region, gaining the attention of the UN, NATO, and Russian political leaders. NATO forces began supporting the Ukrainians, and Russia began thoroughly endorsing and supporting the separatists. This turned the Ukrainian conflict into a proxy war between the majority US and Canadian NATO force and Russia, turning the protests from before into an entire military force. Over the nearly 6 years the conflict has existed, various peace agreements and ceasefires were proposed, but the enforcement of which lacked any existence at all. Daily violations of ceasefire agreements have led to distrust in the military forces and an all-out disregard of peace agreements. In the time that the conflict has existed, pro-Russian forces have captured nearly the entirety of the Donbass region, and Russia itself has annexed a bordering territory called Crimea. Throughout the most recent section of fighting, the pro-Russian forces have been trying to hide their operations in Ukraine and Crimea. Since 2014, 13,000 people have died, a relatively low number, but hundreds of thousands of people now live in active war zones. 1.4 million people have been displaced by the war in Ukraine, and that number increases every day, as covert Russian forces create insurgencies around the Oblast of Luhansk and Donetsk, which contain 4.1 million civilians. The war in Ukraine is still happening today. In fact, the day before writing this, news came out that Russia moved their troops from Crimea, as weeks before they began rallying armed vehicles and soldiers at the border. The confusion, distrust, and mindless fighting has led to the conflict in Ukraine to be one of the most dangerous proxy wars happening now. The tensions between NATO and Russia are the highest they've been since the Cold War, and Russia is not backing down. Today, still, the line between separatist-held territory and Ukrainian territory is one of the most militarized zones in the world, and there's no sign of the war ending.
During the 35 years before the end of World War II, Korea was a region under the control of Japan. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union took control over what is now North Korea, and shortly after, the United States took control in the southern part. That was when Korea was released from Imperial Japan's control and became divided. The separation was originally meant to be just temporary and end after World War II. However, during the presidential election that was meant to reunite the two halves in 1948, the northern half decided not to partake in the voting, which led to the North and South having separate governments. Lee Seung-man, who was extremely against the idea of communism, was elected as the first South Korean president, and Kim Il-sung became the first of the North Korean dictators, and the capital cities of the countries became Seoul in South Korea, and Pyongyang became the capital of the North. 2 years later, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung suggested taking back South Korea and was given the support of the Soviet Union and eventually China. The North invaded the South on June 25, 1950, with nearly 100,000 well-trained soldiers, while the South was completely unprepared for the attack, and that was how the Korean War started. The United States soon became heavily involved in the Korean War, and the main reason for this was the domino theory and their fear of communism. The theory was that if one region became communist, the surrounding areas would quickly become communist as well, eventually leading to the whole world being taken over by communism. The United States intervened with the help of the UN. A resolution was passed by the Security Council on June 27, 1950, and Resolution 83 allowed for member states to aid South Korea. The fighting went on for over 3 years. During that time, Seoul was captured by the northern troops within the first few days, and throughout the years was captured and liberated back and forth 4 times until the capital had been destructed and its population had been decimated. As for Pyongyang, over 250,000 bombs were dropped on the capital of North Korea alone, which heavily impacted the country later on. It is estimated that there were around 5 million casualties, with more than half of them being civilians. Negotiations for the armistice began on July 10, 1951, but it wasn't until 1953 that it was signed. The United Nations, China, and North Korea signed, and the fighting came to an end. A demilitarized zone was built along the 38th parallel, separating the two countries. Since the Korean War, South Korea has rebuilt from the destruction and has become a very modernized country, and Japan rapidly became one of the wealthiest countries in the world due to Americans buying many Japanese products during the Korean War. However, North Korea faced much worse consequences. The massive bombing in Pyongyang and throughout the rest of the country greatly affected the economy and agriculture. There were also floods and droughts as well, which all led to a massive famine in North Korea, which killed about 2% of its already small population.
So I will just wrap this up by saying that I really am so impressed with the intermediates and just their interest and ability to comprehend really big, serious conflicts and sort of the nature of war and peace. And I'm just so thrilled with the group that we have, because I really feel like they have, taken to this unit and really wanted to investigate more about it. And, as you can see from their presentations and from our trip, just have done a phenomenal job. So this is my moment where I get to brag about them a little bit and talk about how wonderful they are.